welcome to Economic Solutions. I'm Leonard Zane, and I'm joined here again by Dr. Jan Martin. Jan, good to be with you again.
Good to be here again.
We are here with program number 6 in the Economic Solutions series, and this program is entitled Economic Recovery, Short-Term and Long-Term. Now this program is happening a lot by popular request. We're in the middle of certain activities and events right now in our economy. Jan and I kicked off the Economic Solutions program in February 2009, and we made certain predictions and analyses back then. And actually what we want to do is play some clips from that February 2009 program and comment on them. So I'm going to start, Jan, by first activating the first clip from February 2009 of Economic Solutions. So it actually starts, I think, Jan, around 1930 or so that the Depression starts? And
That's
then,
right.
You pointed out earlier that we started to improve at a certain point in the 1930s.
Yes, as soon as Roosevelt gets elected right here in 1932, he starts to implement the New Deal, and which is a large spending, many spending bills, and the other part that's important is his banking reform. So he does both of those things, and you can see that the unemployment starts to go down. It starts to go down rather dramatically.
And what year is that?
We're talking about, the turnaround is about 1933, 34. And it jumps down, goes down fairly well, down to right here, which is 1937. And unfortunately, at this point, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, loses his nerve in a way and starts to try to balance the budget. He slashes the programs, he increases taxes, and gets basically slapped upside the head by the economy, and the unemployment jumps from roughly 12% back up to 18% or so. And so then we're in real trouble. He wakes up at this point, reinstitutes the New Deal, increases spending by the government, and then the economy responds again when the unemployment continues to drop.
And it really ends, though, around 1940, right?
That's right.
So it's a 10-year depression, even though there was
Yes.
a slight rise. So that was certainly a very serious and traumatic situation. All right, Jan. Right. So we are looking at a little recap there of the Great Depression. Yep. And you made the point back then in February 2009 that FDR lost his nerve.
Yeah.
Do you see any parallels with that time and what is happening right now?
I do. I don't think Barack Obama has lost his nerve. I think he is constrained by political realities. There's a lot of different stresses on him that tends to push him into doing the same thing as FDR was forced into in 1937.
Yes, very interesting how the economy was actually improving until the mid-30s when FDR did back off of the stimulus spending and actually tightened up on credit and raised taxes.
That's right.
And then things plunged. He had actually gotten it down to about a 12% unemployment rate, but then tightened.
Yes.
We haven't tightened, but we haven't really taken off robustly, have we?
No. You can see that industrial production has actually come back from its nadir, has come back in 1937 to where it was approximately in 1929. So industrial production has come back, and unemployment has come down a lot. I mean, it starts out at 25% in 1933, and by 1937, it's, as you say, down to 12%. That's a dramatic improvement.
Yes. Now, let's proceed with the next clip. So this was a tremendous boost that happened, and that's how we got out. We started to get out a little bit, but as you say, Franklin Roosevelt lost his nerve.
Well, this is the mother of all stimulus packages in a way.
This is huge productivity.
Yeah.
Just unprecedented. So that's how you get out.
I wanted to make one point before we move on to the next slide, is that how big this investment really was in terms of how much the American government was spending. At the peak, the American government was spending roughly 40% of GDP.
Wow.
And so that, I mean, when we're talking about a stimulus package down in here, we're talking 2 to 3% of GDP.
That's not just spending, that's investing.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just spending, but it's
consuming. I mean, I know John Maynard Keynes talked to Franklin Roosevelt, and he made a point, something that I look at with a very jaundiced eye. He told Franklin Roosevelt, well, you can simply, if you want to, just pay people to dig holes in the ground and fill them up again. And as long as you pay them, that's fine. Keynes came from this idea of demand-side economics stimulates spending, but this is supply-side economics.
Well, it's both. It's both demand and supply, because you're controlling the demand in a way, but you also have a huge demand built up because of the war material.
Well, that's right. Yeah, you've actually created the base for potential demand that's enormous, and at the same time, you've gone supply side. John Kenneth Galbraith,
exactly,
a very liberal economist, not known for being a supply sider.
He's a smart guy,
but he was in those days. All right, Jen. So now here we are talking about 40% of the GDP spent as part of the stimulus package just on the outset of World War II.
Well, that was at the peak.
At the peak, yes. That was actually. It started in 1940, and we really rose a lot there, but we saw some charts there that showed what happened with really enormous government stimulus.
Yes.
You have something to read to us, I think.
This is a little bit from a column by Paul Krugman in the New York Times. The story of 1937 of FDR's disastrous decision to heed those who said that it was time to slash the deficit is well known. What's less well known is the extent to which the public drew the wrong conclusions from the recession that followed. Right? Get that? The Republic drew the wrong conclusion from the recession that followed
Sounds
FDR's change.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Far from calling for the resumption of New Deal, they completely lost faith in fiscal expansion.
That sounds very familiar.
Yes, it is. Exactly what we're experiencing
Okay.
now. So, consider a Gallup poll from March 1938. Now, I think the Gallup organization dates back to 1937. So this is very early in the life of that company. Asked whether government spending should be increased to fight the slump, 63% of those polled said no. No. Asked whether it would be better to increase spending or cut business taxes, only 15% favored spending, 63% favored tax cuts. Okay.
Sounds very familiar.
It's so familiar.
Parallel with our time. Are we marching in step? We're marching in step here.
And the 1938 election was a disaster for the Democrats, who lost 70 seats in the House and 7 in the Senate.
Well, that is very familiar with what's going on now.
It
sounds like the public attitude is exactly the same. Now, the point of our program is not to assess public attitude. The point of our program is to find out what looks like it can really work. We'll look at another clip now. But the economy is getting more productive too, so the deficit as a percentage of GDP is actually going down. It's looking really good. Until we get here, sorry to say, Reagan-Bush. What happened here, Ronald Reagan had a budget director by the name of David Stockman, who did warn about this in public, and he said, in order to get out of stagflation, which existed in the Carter administration, we had double-digit interest rates, we had gasoline lines, but Stockman pointed out, he said, well, what they tried first, by the way, was a trickle-down. They tried the Arthur Laffer curve with the idea of cutting taxes for the very rich. I was a big fan of this. I was at USC at the time, and I thought this is going to be great. And the idea was to stimulate the economy by cutting taxes for the rich. They would invest. This would cause a multiplier effect, which would trickle down and stimulate the economy. It was called Reaganomics 1, is what that was called.
Right.
And it failed. And
utterly.
Ross Perot, years later, about 8 years later, actually showed charts on how and why it failed. But Ronald Reagan had another agenda too. He wanted to engage the Soviet Union in an arms race. He wanted to bankrupt them in this arms race.
That was the strategy.
He wanted spending, and he wanted to stimulate the economy. And so David Stockman warned, well, we can do this, but we're going to triple the national debt in 5 years. And in fact, that happened. And so here it goes. And it continued with George H.W. Bush. And then it went on. But then it turned around. When Bill Clinton came in, what he did was he raised taxes for very rich people. Most people didn't see those taxes, but the very rich did. I didn't see them, but very rich people did. And he balanced the budget, actually, did better than that. He had a $132 billion surplus.
Amazing.
Well, so here we are looking at one of the types of proposals, which would be tax cuts. Uh, This was tried beautifully by the Reagan administration. It's a textbook case. We found there that it led to enormous deficits because there really isn't that much leeway, is there, Jan, on actual cutting of spending. Ronald Reagan, his mission, as he had outlined, and so did his budget director, David Stockman, the mission was to try to shrink the size of government, to really do this quite drastically.
That's right.
They found out they really didn't have that much leeway to do that, and I want you to comment a little about that.
No, there's not much in the way of non-discretionary spending that you can actually cut. It's only roughly 4% of the budget. The non-discretionary spending that we have, in terms of Social Security, Medicare, those items, they dominate the budget. So there's not a lot of leeway. You can cut the whole thing and you still don't. All the discretionary stuff you want, you can cut, and you still don't get anything like control over the budget deficits that we're actually going to be seeing and the increase in the debt.
So Ronald Reagan had slashed taxes a great deal, and he tripled the national debt in 5 years.
Well,
even with that,
DOD, he spent a lot of money on defense.
Yes, he did, and we explained that back then in that show about how he had a strategy of bankrupting the Soviet Union in an arms race and pursued that.
Yes.
What happened with Ronald Reagan was enormous deficits, tripling the national debt in 5 years. And even then, even after Reagan, let's see, I get my presidents mixed up a little bit, but I guess it was after H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, when he came in, he actually was able to recover everything and pay the budget was balanced, and we said $132 billion surplus that Bill Clinton had. Actually, it was a $237 billion surplus, but what he did was allocate over $100 billion to pay into Social Security.
Yeah.
And he still ended up with a surplus, but it was a discretionary choice on the Clinton administration's point.
To extend the life of Social Security.
And we pointed out in program number 5, and we encourage people to review that again. Program number 5 is called the cost income gap, I believe. You and I were on that. We pointed out in that program that even with the kind of spending that was going on with Bill Clinton, that the Congressional Budget Office had predicted that the national debt, which was at $5.7 trillion in 2000, was going to be paid off in 10 years. They actually projected that, and we read Alan Greenspan's book, The Age of Turbulence, I think, in program number 5, where Greenspan said, oh my gosh, we're going to pay off the national debt in 10 years.
This is horrible.
And this has implications on the Federal Reserve that we're going to talk about later on in the program. But even with this enormous deficit that built up in the Reagan administration, they were able to recover, create enormous productivity in later administrations, and actually project that the national debt was going to be paid off. That I find very fascinating.
It shows it's doable.
Yes. So now let's look at the next cut.
You should probably say how big the shortfall in demand really is.
Yeah.
I mean, this package does not fill that void.
Well, the value of houses alone, the total housing value in the United States after the collapse is $20 trillion. Now, there was something like a $5 trillion collapse of housing values. So when you're talking those kinds of money, I mean, $5 trillion, you suddenly collapse in value in the economy, you're talking about not even $1 trillion here. We really have a $2 to $3 trillion potential need for stimulus, actually.
That's right. Actually, Obama did say that we were facing a $2 trillion over the next 2 years, and it could be as high as 3, which is
well, when
your
you
number.
lose $5 trillion in housing alone,
but this is the potential.
All right, Jan. So we advocated back in the show in February 2009. We advocated a $2 trillion economic stimulus.
Yes.
And I didn't even know in that show that Barack Obama had advocated the same thing. You pointed it out in the show that that's what Barack Obama advocated. I did an independent analysis of it and came up with, we're going to need $2 trillion. It didn't happen, though.
That's right.
What we got was actually there was a proposal here of 819 to 838 billion, which was the proposed Obama recovery plan, which I call Recovery Plan 1. Actually, what they finally ended up getting was 787 billion.
Yes.
And then a portion of that for housing recovery, 80% of those funds were never tapped because people didn't qualify. We can look back now in retrospect and see that. But anyway, we had what appears here out of this 787 billion that was supposedly up to 838. It looks like it played the same way as Franklin Roosevelt's situation played when he got unemployment down to 12% in the mid-30s.
Right.
And what happened here, we did stop a depression apparently, just as was predicted. But on this show, we said we need a $2 trillion stimulus to really recover and have a robust economy. What we have now, the analysts are saying, well, what do you know, our recession may be over because the growth of the economy has gone up for the past 3 months in a row, and tiny bit, and they see that as maybe that's signaling the end of the so-called Great Recession, as it is now called. But we say the economy is sputtering, and we're going to provide more evidence and talk about that later. It's sputtering. Yes, we didn't have a depression, but we're going to show something about unemployment that is happening in California and in our own region here, because jobs are still very much down. And it appears, again, from what we projected back in February 2009, that the $2 trillion would have done it. Now, there are concerns about that. There are concerns about what about inflation? What about paying down deficit? Because that's deficit spent money.
That's right.
Isn't that worse? And those were the concerns that you pointed out that they exactly had.
That's right.
In 1938.
The public sees it the same way now as it did then.
All right, now let's look at, this is basically the breakdown of what Obama wanted. He got 817. He wanted $2 trillion, so did we on this show. And let's take a look at what actually transpired here in terms of, with the stimulus that we had, did it work? How well did it work? What has happened? And fortunately, there are 3 different independent services that have analyzed this.
Well, there are actually more than that, but
well,
these are
that
3
we're
of the,
showing.
3 of them. Yeah.
And these are very prestigious groups, the Global Insight Macroeconomic Advisors, and the one we like, Moody's Economy.com. And for our audience, Moody's Analytical Group and Economy.com is headed up by Mark Zandi. And just so people know, Zandi is politically a Republican, and he supported John McCain in
He was
the
John
2008.
McCain's economic advisor.
Right, he was economic advisor. We went with Moody's analysis when we did the program in February 2009. We are still sticking with it. And Jan, you may want to comment on these curves here of what happened with the stimulus versus what is modeled that would have happened without it.
With the economy as it was, this is the factual, like the very dark curves are what actually happened with the stimulus package that we put in place, this roughly $800 billion of stimulus. And you can see that although we don't have a huge amount of growth, there is some. It's like 1 to 2%, maybe 3% here at the end of 2010 is projected. And the bad thing is you can see that without it, we would be down at roughly 1%. So we're talking about a 2% difference in GDP growth.
200 basis points.
200 basis points, 2% between what we would have, which would be negative for, let's put it this way. You would have a longer recession.
Or deeper.
And probably both. If the stimulus package had not been passed and used.
Yes, we didn't have a depression. That's the bottom line, Jan.
Yeah, we didn't. You can look at this, we didn't go down really deep.
And it's not as good as what we wanted. It's not as good as what you and I wanted.
No. You see the difference here again is roughly 2 percentage points in unemployment. So although we're 10%, roughly 9.6, we would be at 11.6 if we hadn't spent this money.
Yes, that's exactly what these charts are saying, and I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
All right, so now let's move on. Let's look at the stimulus package. There's actually a website. You can actually plug in your zip code in this website and see what kind of recovery stimulus money went into this particular zip code area, and what did it do with regard to jobs. And so I plugged in the Monrovia basic zip code, and sure enough, something came up.
Yes, of course.
And we've got some contracts here. 3 awards of $691,000, and then we've got grants, 15 grants that were $25.4 million, about 26 million total, and we picked up about 45 jobs. But at least you can look by zip code to see what happened. Again, not a heck of a lot. But this is a $787 billion stimulus.
Spread it over the whole country.
Compared to 40% of the GDP by the federal government to launch us into the tremendous production increase that we had during World War II. So anyway, yeah, something's working. It can be tied. It's rather modest. Did stop the Depression, but not much more than that.
No, that was that 2% number that we talked about. 2% of GDP, 2 to 3% of GDP, is the production shortfall that we saw, the difference between what the economy could grow at and where we were. And that could have been made up if we'd spent our $2 trillion roughly instead of
that we
less than $1.
Yes. All right, now let's look at the next display here. Let's look at the economic pulse as of September 9th.
Yes.
Today is actually September 22nd, but these are the most recent figures that I could assemble. And yes, certain things have happened. We have new state unemployment benefits claims fell by 27,000 to 451,000.
That's good.
The lowest since July 10th. And it was below the 470,000 of new unemployment claims that was expected. So analysts took that as a positive sign.
That number bounces
it
up
bounces,
and down.
but they took it as a positive sign.
Sure, of course they do.
The U.S. trade deficit shrank 14% to $42.8 billion in July, below the $47.3 billion that the markets expected. That was another good sign.
Maybe.
Analysts, therefore, have expected faster third quarter GDP growth. They're looking at these results, and I'm sure they're pretty nervous, but they're saying,
I would be nervous if I had to do that.
But stocks have indeed risen.
Of course.
In about the last 4 weeks, stocks have grown substantially by several hundred points on the Dow. And so this is encouraging, even with the $787 billion stimulus that we did get.
We talked about it. The economy's growing. It's just growing slowly.
Yes.
And the unemployment, this is not going to fix a nearly 10% unemployment rate.
Yes, that's what I have down here. Here's the downside. But U.S. unemployment is still 9.6%. California is 12.4%. Los Angeles County is 12.6%. Monrovia, we're doing a little better, 11.5%. But we're worse than the national average by 200 basis points.
Well, there are some places that are doing actually significantly better than we are.
But look at this. South El Monte, 16.4% unemployment. City of Industry, 22.8% unemployment. And none of these figures count dropouts. And self-employed people like me who could claim being unemployed, but I don't. There are a lot of us like that. So if you look at a place like City of Industry, which is about manufacturing and distribution, at least 1 out of 5 people are out of work. Maybe 1 out of 4 people are out of work. It's equivalent to the Great Depression. We have some really serious things happening to employment in California and in our area.
And this doesn't really capture the underemployment that we have, where people could spend more time but have their hours cut to some half of what they had or 3/4 of what they had.
Now remember, we define a depression as something in excess of 15% unemployment, and we had 25% unemployment in the Great Depression. We have duplicated that in parts of our area right here.
Yes, absolutely.
This is really serious, bad stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm going to look at the next display. So here we go with Moody's again. This came from Moody's, Mark Zandi, his group. Why don't you summarize what's going on here? It's called bang for buck.
Right.
We have tax cuts versus stimulus and investment
and the
type spending.
Right, and if you look at the top, you can see that the straight tax rebates are basically 1-to-1. There's not a lot of gain.
So therefore, if I give somebody a tax rebate of $1 up here,
you get roughly $1 worth of GDP gain.
GDP back, so I'm not making a profit, as I would say in business.
No.
However, if I give somebody a subsidy, this refundable lump sum tax rebate is really a subsidy. Why don't you explain what that is?
This is basically housing here. These are tax cuts that you get for buying a house, buying your primary residence, and the non-refundable lump sum is just a tax cut. If you qualify for it, you get that your taxes reduced by that amount. If you don't pay taxes, you don't get it.
Okay.
The refundable is if you even don't pay taxes, but you buy a house, you still get that money back.
So that's a subsidy.
It's
a subsidy. It's just like paying an unemployment benefit to
money that you can spend on the economy.
Right. So it's a subsidy.
And that's why it's more efficient.
And so what do you know? You get 22 cents back for the dollar. So you're making a 22% profit in GDP if you do that.
Exactly. That's because the person that receives it actually then goes and buys more goods and services.
And that has a trickle and multiplier effect.
Multiplier effect is what this is all about.
All right. Now, temporary tax cuts. This is very interesting. Payroll tax holiday. Okay, that again just means you're not paying payroll taxes for a month or whatever it is.
Employers love this, and so do employees.
And so you're making a 20%, 28% profit if you cut that kind of a tax.
It's more efficient.
Across the board tax cut, well, you don't really make anything. You put out $1, you get back $1.03. Accelerated depreciation, not good. No. You're giving somebody accelerated depreciation. For every dollar you do that for, you only get 25 cents back. You're losing 75 cents on the dollar in GDP. That's very unprofitable. You don't want to do that.
The bottom line for all of these is that they're inefficient.
Well, the point on this, the bottom line as I look at these figures, is simply this. The best deal I'm getting is 50 cents on the dollar. I'm losing 51 cents on the dollar, actually. I'm getting 49-cent return back for
inefficient.
Cutting. If I cut corporate taxes by $1, I only get 30 cents back. I lose 70% on that corporate tax cut. Yeah. Now, we already know from program number 3, and we encourage people to watch program number 3, Novel Ways of Paying for Government. Mm-hmm. We already know that 57% of corporations doing business in the United States pay 0 taxes. So if you're going to cut taxes more, sorry, it's not really going to happen. So there's a lot of rhetoric about how great these are. Ronald Reagan proved that was actually, he tried it under Reaganomics 1, he proved that was not really viable. And then Ronald Reagan went to actually big deficit spending, and that actually stimulated the economy, but he tripled the national debt in 5 years.
That's right.
All right, so let's now look at spending or investment increases. This is very interesting. Extending unemployment insurance benefits. Is that a good deal?
That is incredibly efficient. This means 2 things. One, these are people who will spend the money.
Okay.
You give them money, they will spend it. These are people at the margin who've lost their jobs, who are subsisting on this kind of money, and they go out and spend it right on the things that they need.
So you make a 63% profit on them. Yeah. I mean, to the uninitiated, that's rather surprising, because you think, I'm just throwing that money away. No. I'm actually making a 63% profit on the GDP.
That money gets cycled in very quickly.
How about food stamps? That's a hot one.
Same thing. These are people at the margins. They absolutely spend everything you give them.
These are more poor people than those guys. These guys aren't even looking for work, maybe.
Yeah.
But they're on food stamps. So we're actually making 73% for every dollar?
That's right, because all the money gets cycled around right away. It doesn't go into somebody's savings account, which is what, I mean, that's the big difference between tax cuts for the wealthy and this kind of very marginal, everybody's at the very edge of what they can do, and you give them money and they spend it because they need to.
Okay, let's go to the next one. General aid to state governments.
Government, again,
You
we're
made
not.
38%.
Again, we're keeping jobs going. We're
Okay.
keeping firemen and teachers, and who then spend their money. It's very efficient also.
Okay, and then finally, infrastructure spending.
We like
alternative energy and
infrastructure.
all that. You and I really like,
like
that,
that one a lot.
And you make a 59% profit on the GDP.
Yep.
Looks great. So this is, and remember, this is Mark Zandi. Okay, so
He's an honest man.
let's move on. All right, now let's look at, we talked about Reagan, Bush, and Clinton, and we talk about tax revenues. This is an interesting chart. This chart was put together by Ross Perot, and all I did was put in whose administration was there during all these. Well,
Yeah.
here's Reagan and Bush, and their taxes are lower, and we saw the deficits that resulted.
Right.
Here's Clinton, taxes are higher, but he's taxing very rich people, and the economy is booming.
That's why you get that big increase in the GDP, percentage of GDP from taxes, because the economy is going crazy here.
So, and here's where Congressional Budget Office projected they were going to pay off the national debt in 10 years.
If they'd done that, see at 2000, right? That's right here,
Yeah,
2000.
Right.
We were still, they were still having a lot of
Right.
revenue at this point.
So now G.W. Bush cut taxes $3 trillion is what he did. And what happened was revenues fell, the government went into more deficits, and we know what happened there with the war spending and so on.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move on from this slide just to show, though, that, wow, this way you're funding the government with revenues that are really generated, and you're not doing it with deficit spending. You're doing it with taxes, and you had a boom. And
But you had a boom at the same time,
and
which
you
is
had a
the key.
progression, you had a projection that we were going to pay off the national debt of $5.7 trillion in 10 years.
At that rate, we could have.
All right, so let's look on to the next one. September 2010, Obama Recovery 2 Plan. This is a very recent announcement by the president on, $50 billion for infrastructure investments over 6 years, actually, mainly for roads, rails, and airport runways. Transportation.
It's good to do this.
Transportation experts say 35,000 jobs are created for every $1 billion in transportation construction investment. So I worked that out. That's $29,000 per job. Wow. So for every amount of stimulus, let's say, that the government spends on construction, if the government, through civic capital, invests in the private sector, they get, in construction, about $29,000 of that creates one job.
That's pretty efficient.
That's very efficient.
Yeah.
Finally, you have a cut in business taxes that the Obama administration is proposing of $200 billion over 2 years, encouraging going ahead with plant and equipment investments. Well, we've already shown
If you go back to that
tax cut or stimulus display that
doesn't
may
help
be a
much.
political expediency, but it really economically is not producing
That's
all
the
that
0.3 and 0.4 kind of level for. And if you look back at Mark Zandi's chart,
Right.
it's not very
This
efficient.
to me doesn't look real. It looks just like a political.
This is good. This is
effort.
good as
But
far
it's
as it
not
goes,
much.
but it's
not-
small.
It's very small. And we already said $2 trillion back in February 2009. So
way too
let's
small.
look on some more. Now here's our proposal on this program. What we're saying, ES6 being Economic Solutions Program 6, Recovery Plan 2. We're saying we have charted actually that Moody's $787 billion stimulus that they tracked in 2009 and 2010 created about a $460 billion GDP increase and 2.7 million new jobs. Now that was tracked by Moody's and analyzed, and we've kind of gone along with them in our analysis. That was not as efficient as construction.
Not every
investment.
area is as efficient as that. And this is all, I guess, the whole stimulus package was not aimed at construction. There was a whole bunch of other pieces, as we noted before.
Yes, and so this one, it takes $170,000 of GDP increase to create one job, and it takes $211,000 of stimulus spending to create one job. It only took 29,000 for construction, but this takes almost 10 times.
But this has got tax cuts in it and all kinds of stuff.
It's got everything,
like
yeah. Not as efficient as construction, but we're not all building and doing construction.
I don't think we could actually absorb a whole, $2 trillion worth of construction jobs.
That's not what we're trying to do. All right, so our plan says, here's an infrastructure breakdown that adds up to $963 billion that we would call the phase 2 of the economic stimulus that we say is required on this program. We break it down. Alternative energy, $127 billion. Nanotechnology, and we're going to talk more about that. That doesn't appear on anything until now, and we're going to say why later. $28 billion for nanotechnology. Education, $200 billion, and we're going to say why on that later. Science, including the Super Collider, which is one of my pet projects I'd like to see happen, to regain world leadership in particle physics research, which we gave up to Europe actually with CERN. $153 billion, which includes the Super Collider and other things. States and SCORE business aid. These are mentoring projects that get people trained to do business. Mm-hmm. Transportation and byways, $167 billion.
That's the efficiency part.
Right. Water treating, flood control, environmental, $45 billion. Worker aid, that's analogous to state aid. That's $57 billion. So this is our proposal of what we are advocating. And let's look at the profit that we project using the Moody's model on what kind of profit and boost to our economic performance would occur. Well, here's $963 billion that we would invest in this phase 2 stimulus. It would return $1,382 billion, or a $419 billion profit, and creates about 2.5 million jobs.
Excellent.
It brings the unemployment down on the average from 9.6% to 7.6%. But what is this $419 billion applied to, Jan?
Well, that's really the profit. That's the
additional profit. And what are we going to do with that?
Well, that's the additional GDP that we'll have.
Yeah, but what would be done with that?
That's a good question.
My point is this. You pay down the deficit with that.
You could do that.
See, what you did, you took out a deficit of $963 billion for the phase 2 stimulus. You got back $1.38 trillion. You made a $400 billion profit. Not only did you pay back the deficit that you took of the 963, you made $419 billion more that you can actually pay down the existing government deficit. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what reconciles what you're seeing played out in Washington rhetorically. But in fact, what you're able to do with stimulus, you're able to move the economy again and get us producing again. You're able to create jobs, and you're able to pay down more deficit than you would have without it. It's a paradox.
We spend, we go into debt, but we make more money, so we pay down not only our debt, but we pay down more than when we started. So instead of spending, we end up saving.
So this is really amazing. A lot of people are alarmed at national debt going up.
Well, there should be some.
This shows, and with the Moody's model, it shows that actually, really, it pays it down. It gets us out of trouble and pays it down. All right, so we have some websites here where the infrastructure is in place for mentoring, especially by elders. There are people who are elder who cannot get a job. They're age discriminated against. And yet they have tremendous knowledge and ability to teach the younger generation, but don't get any money for it. Well, here are 4 different groups: experiencecorps.org, seniorcorps.gov, mentoring.org, juniorachievement.org. They all have the infrastructure in place for mentoring kids, both through grade school, high school, even college. We could raise the level of our performance and give these elders who can't find any work something gainful to do to contribute to our economy. So this is a tremendous possibility, and like I said, Jen, this would put hundreds of thousands of people to work. It's a $200 billion program we're talking about. And we want to be better, we want to be more competitive in the world arena, and we're not. We're falling back on that now. Yeah. And so this will really jumpstart us or catapult us over the long run.
This is one of the requirements to move forward.
Exactly.
Yes.
Is there a limit to these economic stimuli? I mean, why aren't we just throwing, fake money to stimulate the economy indefinitely and pay off the deficit more and more? No, there is a limit.
No.
There is a limit, and it has to do with the industrial capacity of the United States, or any economy really, the utilization.
Yes.
We have found empirically that you can push an economy to about 90% of its capacity without inflation.
Yes.
If you try to go beyond that, you get inflation and you get negative returns, diminishing returns on any kind of stimulus.
The government
money.
basically crowds out private investment.
Exactly so. So here's where we were in 2008 at the trough when our economy crashed. We were at 68% industrial utilization, very low. That's really dangerously low. Today, well, we stopped the depression, but we're only 75% utilization.
Yeah.
So we can put all this stimulus money in there, and it won't matter until this utilization starts pushing up towards 90%. So that's the maximum.
You could also look at unemployment. It's a similar kind of number. There's a number down around 4% where we can't push past that, and if we try to, we'll get inflation.
Exactly. Now, Jen, you also made a good point. I asked you when we were analyzing this, I said, well, what do we think is the outlook for inflation? And you said, well, gee, just look at the Treasury bill rate, which it is everybody.
That interest rate is what all the smart money out in the world thinks the 10-year inflation rate is going to be.
That's correct. That's correct.
And the number that came out today is 2.5%.
Okay. The 10-year as of the 17th of 3 days, or no, actually 5 days ago, was 2.75. Was 2.75%.
It's down. It's below that now.
So everybody is betting, the whole market is betting, that inflation is not on the horizon.
That's right.
So we're looking at stimulus. We're looking at paying down the deficit as part of the results of the stimulus, and we're looking at no inflation.
That's right.
How good does it get, really, in terms of the prospect?
It's all about psychology, as we talked about earlier on when I read that little excerpt about the Gallup poll. It's about how people think. But the numbers don't lie.
The numbers are here. Here's the reality. Now, whether this actually happens and is acted upon, that depends on much psychology and politics that we're not involved in here. We're just looking at the analysis of what shapes up and what appears to be the solution to this. And I see no roadblocks to this. Okay, now let's talk about more things that can happen with stimulus in the future. We talk about how we've lost American manufacturing and jobs, and the issue of scaling comes up.
Yes, it
and
does.
Would you like to comment on that?
What I'm talking about when we're talking about scaling, we're talking about taking a very small enterprise, a few employees, and scaling it up to full production with many thousands of employees and producing millions of widgets a year, whatever that is, whatever the widget is that we're talking about.
So it's mass production.
It's really mass production, going up from teeny tiny, from your backyard to mass production.
And we've lost an awful lot of mass production, which is happening in other countries, as we well know, in our behalf. And our trade deficit grows because we're doing that.
And the question is, how can we get that back?
And our jobs go down because of that, yes. And so how do we get that back? Scaling. In other words, we have to produce at greater scale.
We have to be smarter about how we scale up. We have no dearth of brilliant backyard garage inventors, guys who come up with brilliant ideas. What we have a dearth of is ways that we can get those guys and their ideas into mass production in America with American workers.
All right, now here's a point I want to make, and it goes back to program 3 again. It gets down to General Motors, for example. was building the electric car, the EV1, that they terminated in the 1990s. They terminated that because they needed $2 billion of additional investment in the program, and they didn't do that. They were looking at short-term profit outlooks. They had uncertainties in the future. They canceled the entire program for $2 billion. This is, again, the case for civic capitalism, where so many countries all over the world partner with the private sector. It's not socialism. It's pooling common resources through government into the private sector.
Yes.
Giving GM that $2 billion. Had that happened, it could well have been that GM would have peppered the world with the EV2 car that would have had more efficiency, would have been way ahead of everybody else. But that didn't happen. So we have the ability, we're talking stimulus here.
Yes.
We have the ability to use civic capital to do things that the private sector is too jittery about because they are too concerned with short-term returns.
That is absolutely correct.
Now, so we could, with civic capitalism, with, as we've said, could happen with a stimulus program, revitalizing American manufacturing for intelligent and higher scaling manufacturing process software. You want to comment on that?
I think that's part of how we will become. We won't be able to compete with people low wage states. There's no way we're going to have very, very low wages. So the American worker has to become more productive.
Well, I have one thing we could do, though. I say what we could do is demand that all those other countries provide the same benefits for their workers as we provide our workers.
Correct.
So that levels the playing field more.
Somewhat. But there still would be, on the average, cheaper per worker than we would be. But
we have to get better anyway.
We have to be smarter about it.
Right.
And software is one thing that we are very, very, very good at. Yeah.
Another area is alternative energy leadership, such as batteries.
Yes.
New photovoltaic technology, not the existing photovoltaic technology.
Right.
New photovoltaics, and we're way up there in the advance of our ability to develop these things if we go for it and if we scale it.
Yeah.
And then fuel cells. We're going to show something with fuel cells in a coming slide. That's another area that we could take over and lead the world in manufacturing, not just services.
That's right.
We have the ability to do this. We could become the world nanotechnology manufacturing leader. We have the most advanced nanotechnology science in the world. I think you can agree on that. You're in a better position to say that I am.
I wouldn't actually be surprised if that were the case.
All right. We could become the world nanotech manufacturing leader. That could revolutionize manufacturing. If you do things nanotechnologically in manufacturing, it could change the whole way that manufacturing happens in many sectors. So this we could take over there. Super Collider, I'm talking about that all the time in a number of my shows. It would recover the world physics lead for the United States in subatomic particle research, and many are of the opinion that that's where the greatest scientific discoveries are going to be made, in subatomic physics. All right, military spending. This is going to be quick. We've looked at this slide before, but we talked about flexibility, where we don't have a lot of flexibility in things that we can cut or reallocate. Well, guess what? This is $607 billion, 41.5% of what the 15 leading nations in the world spend on military.
And this was back in 2008.
It's gone up to 850 now.
Yeah.
It's 7 times more than China, 10 times more than Russia. I mean, look at all these curves. So this is an area that I would certainly look at. If I'm thinking about productivity, am I really that concerned about being so many times stronger militarily? I think I can give up $100 billion here.
I think you
can use that.
I think you can use up $200 billion easily.
Okay, so that's just a quick flash. Here is a scaling possibility. This is Bloom Energy. We had them shown on a previous program. They've come up with these 2 fuel cells that this fellow is holding. His name is K.R. Sridhar. He's founder of the company. Back in February of 2010, he said, with one of these, you can power a European home. With 2 of them, you can power an American home. Now, you do need an inverter.
Oh, there's
you need
lots more.
Other technology. But he's got something. John Doerr, who is the venture capitalist leader who funded Amazon.com and Google, funded Bloom Energy to the tune of $400 million. Not bad, almost $500 million. But look what you could do with civic capitalism and scaling if you put it into this. We could manufacture, we could take over, we could lead, and I know that's what Professor Sridhar wants. He was a professor at Arizona State University. We have tremendous opportunities here,
yes,
but it requires a partnership of invested capital channeled through government as well as private sector.
Yes.
Other countries such as Germany and Denmark,
they do that,
are making this happen. France,
Japan has done
80% nuclear power in France. They're making it happen. Japan, Australia, New Zealand. This old paradigm of socialism versus capitalism, it's not even relevant. We're not talking socialism at all.
No.
We're talking capitalism 100%, done by both market forces with
yes,
the private sector and channeled through government for the public sector. And other countries are making this work.
Well,
Germany is 10 years ahead of their solar power goals.
Right, and that's because they made a conscious decision that they were going to just fund photovoltaics.
So we could become the leader in fuel cells, not to mention new photovoltaic technology that we might be able to surpass everybody on. We could surpass them there maybe, surpass them here maybe. Yeah. So we have tremendous opportunities.
I think the alternative energy area is a huge area, and everybody knows. I mean, we're not alone in this. Everybody, the Chinese know, the Indians know, the Europeans know that alternative energy is the future. Oil is not going to last that much longer. We're going to have to be doing something different. Everybody sees it. So we've got to be there with everybody else.
Exactly. Now, let's look one more thing about balanced budgets. This is something I really like because I'm advocating deficit stimuli right now, but I'm a balanced budget advocate, and we showed how you get that in our current economic situation with the stimuli. But long term, yes, we can actually balance budget with more productivity and more performance and tax revenues the government gets without having to deficit spend to fund government operations. Well, without Treasury debt, if you pay off the national debt, which is currently about the same as the GDP, it's about 14 trillion right now, and that's what our GDP is right now. 1 year of GDP equals the entire national debt. This is not out of reach.
No.
So without Treasury debt, if we pay off the national debt completely, and Andrew Jackson did that in his administration.
He's the only one that ever did.
Yeah, down to $38,000, and he also abolished the central bank.
And then they had a big recession after that. By the way.
They did. But
and then the bank created again.
Not until 1913. You're talking 1830s all the way to 1913. No. As we pointed out in an earlier program from Alan Greenspan's book, Age of Turbulence, he said, oh my gosh, if you pay off the national debt, the Federal Reserve has nothing to trade with. They trade in government securities. The Federal Open Market Committee is all of that. The way money is created and regulated by the Federal Reserve is done by that. So if you paid off the national debt, as they projected under Bill Clinton back then, well, if you actually did that, that would make Ron Paul very happy because there would be no Federal Reserve
he would be
functioning. It would just decline naturally with the debt and have less and less impact, and you wouldn't get this tremendous inflationary expansion with what we saw that really precipitated the 2008 crash that was so similar in so many ways to the 1929 crash. So my view is, hey, great. Eventually we could get into balanced budgets. In fact, we could start if we start stimulating right now.
We have to have balanced budgets before we get, I mean, that's the only way to pay for the debt is to have balanced budgets.
We can actually start paying the debt down right now. If Washington had the wherewithal or the nerve to go through with the phase 2 stimulus that we are recommending on this program, they would actually pay down the national debt. Even the Moody's model shows that. So if that happens over years and you're paying down the national debt with productivity, and as long as we're under that 90% ceiling and you're doing this, eventually you get to a situation where you don't really need the Federal Reserve to create all this money, And you could go back to gold-backed money. I'm not saying gold-traded money, but I'm saying certain reserve.
That doesn't work.
A reserve until Richard Nixon got rid of it. We were still on a gold reserve system where you had, in FDR's time, it was like 35.
It was a very stable
35% was gold required for the money that you had.
I remember things being very stable during that period.
And Nixon, up to Nixon, I think we were at something like 25% or maybe even 30. And then Nixon went off the gold-backed standard entirely. And then Johnson is the one who eliminated silver money completely. But gold-backed, if you're just gold-backed, that puts the brakes on this inflationary monetary expansion created by the Federal Reserve. We already talked about what this did to the economy in our February 2009 program. So this is where I'm saying, guess what, folks? If you want to be prosperous, stimulate. If you want to pay the deficit, stimulate. If you want to get rid of the Federal Reserve inflationary effect on our economy, stimulate. And we can actually get to the point of paying down this national debt. Do we want to pay off the national debt? Of course. Do we want to pay off personal debt? Do we want to have enormous mortgages like we have right now? Absolutely not. We have shown on this program how to get there. I think we've made it as graphically clear as you can possibly get. I don't know what the powers that be are going to do.
Politically, again, that's not what we do.
That's not what we're about here.
The growth in healthcare costs, for example, is one thing that if you don't take care of those, you won't be able to pay down the debt.
Now that's true. Our program number 4,
you talked about
Professor Gerald Kaminsky, who showed that the bulk of the countries in Europe and New Zealand and Australia and Japan are operating at half our cost per person. France is an excellent model.
But we need to do that, is my point.
See, we need to look at what these countries are doing because, you know, the United States used to pride itself in our multiculturalism and in drawing from advantages from many different national and cultural roots. That's been a tremendous teamwork strength of the U.S. We've been great teamers, very great team players. Right now, we're terrible team players. Jimmy Carter even said just the other day on Larry King how much support he had from the Republicans. He said they were very supportive of my administration. He had disasters that happened economically that we could talk about, the stagflation, the double-digit interest rates, the gasoline lines. It was terrible. But it was interesting that he said, oh, no, I have no complaints. We, as far as that goes, we cooperated very well. So, yes, it is complex, Jan.
It is.
That's true. But we've outlined a roadmap here.
If you add up all of the information, maybe there's enough to tell us how do we do it.
And finally, what happens if all this works out the way we project that it could? We already in one program recommended the book Innovation Nation by an innovation expert, Dr. John Cale. We encourage people to read this book to see how we can recover in the United States with scaling, with education, with the whole business, so that we can have what we want. We want a home that we own. We don't want a lot of debt in ourselves or in the government. We want that. I don't know of any American who doesn't love political freedom. I've never met an American who is not a rebel somehow against government control and who doesn't want political freedom. I haven't met one. We all want that. I think in this show we're very compatible with that. We want to educate, and we can put to work.
We can't get there without this.
We have to have this. And we can put these elders who are out of work to work to get us through grade school, college, the whole business. And so anyway, Jan, I think that's about it for this program. What do you think?
I think we're done.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for watching. We encourage you to watch repeatedly, and we certainly encourage lots of your input. We've been very animated on this program, but there's an awful lot of emotion going around these days, but we kind of like the positive emotions, I think, that we feel because of the possibilities. So thanks very much, and come back to see us.